Hi, welcome to this episode of Faith and Logic. In this episode of Faith and Logic, we are going to discuss about is Easter pagan? Now, since Easter is around the corner, there are many people who say the name Easter, it's pagan. So in this video, we are going to evaluate the claims that are presented about Easter and some of the Easter traditions, and we are going to examine these claims based on the historical, linguistic, and cultural analysis, and we are going to debunk some of the arguments which are given to say that Easter is pagan. Now, whether to celebrate some days are special or not, which is purely subjective, as Romans 14 and verse 5 and 6 says, one person esteems one day above another, esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. And he who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks, he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. So again, a person who is observing, he's considering one day to be special than other day, he is doing it to the Lord. And the one who does not observe the day, well, he is also doing it to the Lord. Whether you eat, drink, whatever that you do, you have to glorify God. So whether you are celebrating Easter, considering it as a special day or not, which is purely subjective, but calling Easter pagan, that is not true. So let's just begin this video by examining the core claims. Now, as I said, there are people who say that Easter traditions are pagan, especially the name, the Easter, the origin of the name. Then what about the Easter bunnies? What about eggs, decorating eggs, and Easter egg hunting and all that things? So these are some of the popular online claims that people make to say that Easter is pagan. If you examine this, the sources behind this claim are purely internet myths. It's not scholarly arguments, but they are picking up these claims from the internet. These claims are historically weak and largely based on misunderstanding. So let's just look at some of these claims. First is associating Easter with the name Ishtar. Now, Ishtar, she was an ancient Mesopotamian goddess around 2000 BC. She's associated with love, war, fertility, which is completely unrelated historically to the celebration of Easter, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, this goddess is much more earlier than the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. This is what the popular internet sources claim. Now, we have to understand that associating Easter with Ishtar, there is no linguistic link associated with both of this. Now, the name Easter comes from the Germanic languages. Now, Ishtar, the goddess, then that name comes from Akkadian language. So it's a Mesopotamian language. Linguistically, there is no shared linguistic root between these two words. So the argument basically collapses immediately. It is similar to say Jordan as a country is similar to Jordan River, and it is also similar to Michael Jordan. So just because Michael Jordan has Jordan name in it, that doesn't mean that he's same as Jordan River or same as Jordan as a country. Similarly, Turkey as a country is different from Turkey the bird, simply because Easter matches with Ishtar. That is called association fallacy. So we need to avoid this type of fallacy. Just because it sounds similar, that doesn't mean both are same. Many people try to associate Easter with Ostara, one of the English monk, a historian and theologian, one of the important scholars of early medieval Europe. His name is Bede. He is often called as Venerable Bede. He was from the 7th century. He mentions Ostara only once in his writing, and he is a 7th century monk historian, so he is quite later after the Christians were celebrating death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus as Easter. First of all, he is very late in the tradition. Now, why it matters? Because Bede is someone who wrote the ecclesiastical history of English people, and he preserved the early English church history, calendar system, and traditions. Now, what did Bede say about Ostara? So, Bede mentioned a figure called Eostre, often spelled as Ostara, in his work. His claim is that pagan Anglo-Saxons had a goddess named Eostre, and they celebrated festivals in her honor. Later Christians used the same name for the resurrection celebration. That is what Bede claims, and he only mentions Ostara by name once in his writing. Now, according to Bede, Ostara is supposed to be a spring fertility goddess. According to modern scholarship, this is highly uncertain existence. This is the only historical reference to Ostre or Ostara. There is no archaeological evidence, no other written sources that talks about Ostara. There are no records that pagan worship this goddess named Ostara. So Bede may have misunderstood the seasonal term or interpreted a month name as deity or even mistaken the reference. That's about Ostara claim. Now let's talk about the connection of Easter with Pascha. Most of the languages, especially non-Germanic languages, they associate Easter. If you look at the etymology of the word Easter, it is associated with Passover or Pascha. Only English and German language calls it as Easter. So especially English language calls it Easter, German calls it Ostern. But if you look at any other non-Germanic languages such as Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Hebrew, Greek, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Arabic, even in Malayalam, it is called Pascha. Like, for example, Dutch call it as Pasen, Swedish calls it as Pask, Norwegian language calls it as Paske, Danish calls it as Paske, Hebrew it is Pesach, Passover, and Greek it is Pascha. So all the non-Germanic languages except English and German, Easter is associated with Pascha or Passover, and the root word it came from Passover, which is a Jewish celebration. Now, it has a biblical roots in it. Only in German and English language, which is a Germanic language, it is called Easter or Ostern. But in all the other languages, the meaning of the word or the root word is associated with Pascha or Passover. Now, let's look at the origin of the word Easter. The etymology. Istromonath is the Old English name for the spring month. This is based on the timing. Easter, as we know, typically comes during the spring month. So this is a month of down. The meaning is month of down or springtime. So Istromonath is the Old English name for the spring. Resurrection occurred during that time. So that's why from the month name Istromonath, they may have given the resurrection of Jesus that day name as Easter. It has nothing to do with Ishtar or Eostre, the Anglo-Saxon goddess, or Ishtar, which was a Mesopotamian goddess associated with fertility. Simply, it has to do with the month, Easter Monath, which is basically meaning springtime. Now, the name came from the calendar timing and not deity. For example, if you see 4th of July, so we call the Independence Day 4th of July. It's a date from which we know that it's an Independence Day. Another example would be Cinco de Mayo. Cinco means 5th and Mayo means May, so it's 5th of May. It just simply has to do with the date and not with God. Cinco de Mayo originates from the unexpected Mexican victory over French forces at the Battle of Puebla on May 5th, 1862. We all know the history. So 4th of July or Cinco de Mayo has nothing to do with any god. It just simply, it occurs in the month of July. We call it Independence Day. It occurs in May. We call it Cinco de Mayo. Easter also because it comes during the springtime. And the month name in Old English is Easter month, from which the word originated, Easter. So that's the origin of the word Easter. Now, we also have a myth, which is Easter bunny. What does bunny has to do with Easter or the resurrection of Jesus? It has nothing to do with the resurrection of Jesus. Is it a pagan fertility symbol? They claim that rabbits, they symbolize fertility, and therefore it's a pagan symbol. It has no ancient origin as such. There is no ancient tradition that associate resurrection of Jesus with any bunny. So the earliest known reference to Easter bunny tradition comes from the 16th century Germany around 1572. German children were told about animal that laid eggs and hid them in the nest or garden. So well-behaved children would find these eggs. Now it's important to note here that this is a late development in the history, almost 1500 years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, long after the ancient pagan religions had faded in Europe. So most of the historians generally agree that there is no solid evidence that Easter hare comes from pagan worship. Rabbits or hares are not a dominant fertility symbol in any specific ancient pagan religion. So to call bunnies our pagan fertility symbol, it's just a myth and there is no reality in it. Easter hare. So originally it was hare and not the rabbit. Hare are biologically different from rabbit. Now the cultural context is that hares were common in Europe folklore. There is a difference biologically between a rabbit and hare. Rabbit is associated with a springtime activity. We see the rabbits come out after the cold winter months during the springtime. We can see them in the fields. Now, this shows that the tradition is regional and cultural and not ancient religious. So, it has nothing to do with Easter. Hare is biologically different from rabbit. They cannot interbreed. They have different behavior and symbolism. Easter hare has nothing to do with resurrection of Christ or any myth regarding the fertility. So that's about Easter hare. Jacob Grimm in the 19th century tried to connect pagan fertility with rabbits. So his speculation was that since rabbit reproduce quickly and fertility was a theme in ancient religions, maybe there is a connection between Easter and the rabbit. So that was the claim of Jacob Grimm. So where did the pagan fertility idea came from? It came from Jacob Grimm. Now Grimm, he studied the European folklore. The key problem here is that he did not provide evidence for any of his theory. There is no ancient text that associated rabbits with Easter. There is no mention of pagan rituals involving rabbits, and there is no historical continuity in these claims. So it was a hypothesis that Jacob Grimm gave. It's not a documented fact. Now, what is the explanation behind rabbits? So rabbits are visible in the spring. They are highly visible in the fields. Spring is a time of new life, seasonal change. So people naturally associated hares or rabbits along with spring and celebrations. So the conclusion is that it's all seasonal association and it has nothing to do with the religious origin or nothing to do with Easter or the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, what about the eggs? What about the Easter egg myth? So, Easter eggs are pagan ritual. That's what some people claim. Eggs are pagan fertility symbol. That's what they say. So, eggs, as we know, is the common food across the culture. Even in the old time, eggs were common across the cultures. Eggs are used in many contexts, not uniquely pagan. What about the history? How did eggs started associated with Easter? The earliest record that we have about eggs during the Easter time is from Edward the First of England in the 13th century. At the time, in 13th century, eggs were common food. They were affordable, easily available to most of the people. So instead of buying expensive gifts, eggs become practical and symbolic gift. Think of it like modern day sweets or chocolates. Now, no one in the 13th century connected this to the paganism. There is no record that says that this comes from pagan fertility rituals. There is no mention of pagan gods or pagan ceremonies, religious borrowing. There is nothing like that. So basically, Edward the First, the King of England in 13th century, he ordered hundreds of eggs to be hard boiled, and there is a reason for why they had to do hard boiled because during the Lent season, during the Easter time, everybody is fasting. So the best way to preserve eggs is to hard boil them. And he commanded them to be decorated with a gold leaf, and these eggs were then given as a gift during Easter. So that's how the eggs got associated with Easter in the 13th century, which is very late years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So eggs has also, again, nothing to do with Easter. The common Lent practices during the Lent, 40 days before Easter, Christians typically fasted from eggs, so they prefer not to eat eggs, but chickens kept laying eggs. The best way to preserve the eggs is to boil them. Now, by Easter, people had lots of eggs. So, what they do? They ate them, they shared them as a gift, they decorated them. But Easter egg has nothing to do with the death, burial, or resurrection of Jesus. Eggs associated with pagan rituals, which is also a myth. We can conclude this video based on the evidences that we saw, historical evidence, linguistic evidence, and some of the tradition that evolved much later in the history, mostly in the 13th to 16th century. Based on this, we can conclude that the name Easter is not pagan. None of the rituals are pagan. These are simply a cultural traditions. So people who say that Easter is pagan, those claims have very weak historical evidence. Some of them are merely speculations, and this became widely popular because of the internet. So these are the internet myth. But when we say that Easter is not pagan and these traditions are not pagan, we are not defending the commercialization of Easter celebrations. Those are simply distractions. But we are trying to correct the false claim about pagan origin. So if someone says that Easter is pagan, how you can respond? You can respond the name Easter itself has the linguistic evidence that we gave. It has to do with the month Easter, the spring month, then Easter bunny. That tradition started in the 16th century, which is simply a cultural symbol. Nothing has to do with the resurrection. Easter eggs that started in the 13th century by the King of England. Again, during the Lent season, the best way to preserve egg was to hard boil them. People started decorating that. People started giving gifts because it was the most affordable option to give gifts during the 13th century. So it has nothing to do with Easter. The claim that Easter is pagan is not supported, as we saw in the video, by the strong historical evidences. Now, what is the true meaning of Easter? The central truth lies in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The crucifixion and resurrection is the historical fact that happened in the history. The crucifixion and the resurrection is very important soteriologically for our salvation. Our redemption was achieved by Jesus Christ on the cross. So our focus should be on the gospel and Jesus Christ during the Easter or the Resurrection Sunday. Many people, those who have problems saying Easter or Happy Easter, you can say Happy Resurrection Day, or as we have seen, the origin of the word Easter has to do with the Passover. You can say Pascha if you have a problem with the name Easter. But as we saw in the video, there is nothing pagan about the origin of Easter or the name Easter. It is simply the spring month in the Old English language, which is called Easter, from where the word came Easter. So I hope this video has helped you understanding about some of the myths that originated primarily due to internet. So this has no historical background. Some of the myths are simply speculations. People are trying to attach Ishtar, the goddess, or Ostara with Easter. But as we have seen in this video, they were much later development. Most of them are like in 7th century and later. I hope this episode has helped you understanding the origin of the word Easter, and to understand that it has nothing to do with any pagan tradition or any pagan origin. So you all can celebrate Easter, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The crucifixion and resurrection are historical fact. Jesus died and he rose from the dead on the third day, as the scripture claims. Thank you and God bless.